name is Paul Raff. This section is about ensuring trustworthiness and quality. Just for a matter of logistics, we have about 10 minutes till the all-important break. Just to talk about what I'm going to go over, there are kind of three main areas: data pipeline, analysis mechanisms, and how we properly interpret analysis. So a lot of this is going to be, some of this is repeating what's been said before by Ronnie and Lucas, but I go into a little bit more detail. Just like I said, for logistics, I'm going to go through the data pipeline, then we're going to break, and then we'll go through the final two after the break. And so ultimately, what we want to find out here is, like it's been repeated many times, we want to have what we call external validity. Whatever we observe in the experiment, we want to be able to trust as a proper reflection of what's happening in the real life. Yeah. So, now I understand a lot of you, are graduate students, postdocs, come from academia. Ben had a great comment, which I emailed to my team actually while he said it, where he mentioned, I think, 10,000, number 10,000. It could be a very large number if you're from university. It could be a very small number if you're from industry. That is absolutely true. But regardless, the quality of the data is going to be very important. A lot of what I'm going to be showing here is really more applicable to A/B experimentation at scale, which is primarily an industry setting. That said, these are all good things that we need to keep track of when we're handling data, big or small. Okay, and so when we think about data from a very abstract perspective, when we think about how it's collected, we have a situation where in the online setting, we have a whole bunch of servers. They are collecting what we call raw events. And then there's essentially a big process that happens periodically, what we call the cooker. It has this kitchen terminology. And then what we have at the end is we have cook logs. And this is what we use as experimenters, as business analysts, as anyone. This right here is the data that we use to do all the analysis that we do to drive the business, which includes experimentation. Okay? And so this is a nice conceptual, simple flow for data. But in reality, at best, this is what our data pipeline looks like. It's a massive machine. There are a lot of different things that could happen in the data pipeline. And one thing that you can't really tell from this graph, which is, so it's a standard graph, this isn't the data pipeline for Bing, but you somewhat don't know what goes in, and in a lot of cases, you don't know necessarily everything that comes out. And so it's important to understand the data pipeline. And there's really one big key point to the data pipeline that you want to keep in mind as it relates to running trustworthy experiments and doing trustworthy analysis. And this is what I call no data left behind. Yeah. And so, it's a good one. Thank you. I like that response. But ultimately, no data left behind means don't leave data behind. If you have something that goes into your data pipeline, it should go out of your data pipeline in some form. That doesn't mean it has to go out in the same form that everyone must consume. Okay? There must be some place where data can go in this case. And it's best done through example. And so let me talk about this really common example. We had a meeting last week with some teammates, and a colleague mentioned that they ran into this problem specifically for the team that they're working in. So this is a legitimate problem that happens a lot. When we think about web services, when we think about the online setting, we have a server, we have a client. They both produce logs. The server is much more closer to the system than the client, and so we see often that the client's logs get delayed. If you're on a mobile phone, for example, you may not be able to send logs until you're in a Wi-Fi connection. Okay? That said, we still need to process the logs. And so one common pattern that we have is that we have essentially a daily snapshot of client logs and server logs. And you can see conceptually that we have delays in the client logs, and these delays persist beyond the day boundary. Okay? And so there's a common join key, and so when we want to consider bringing these logs together to produce one data set that we can look at, looking at server-side data and client-side data, we have some issues here. Okay? And so when you think about no data left behind, the wrong way to do it would be to only keep the data that does match each day, and you discard the data that doesn't match. Okay? But the proper way to do this is there are two different ways you can think about it, in two different ways that you can work through this. We can have essentially what we call debug outputs or extra outputs where unmatched data goes. Okay, so we have the proper data set of fully matched data, and we have a separate data set for client logs that weren't matched. We also have a separate data set for server logs that weren't matched. That could happen too. And then we can also think about the notion of reprocessing continuously. So every day we could do this, but then every day we could also reprocess the last 2 days, the last 3 days, the last 7 days, and we'd further increase our match rate in the process. Okay, so this is a key concept in which, one of the ways in which you have to think about data carefully if you want to properly analyze your experiment and have trustworthy data. Okay? Now, from that perspective, realize that in a lot of cases, when you run a lot of experiments, a lot of different things can happen. And one of the things that could happen, and Ronnie had a great example in his introduction, was that your experiment can influence the data pipeline. And the main example we see in this situation is about bot detection. So as Ronnie mentioned, over 50% of our data are bots. We don't want to burden the end analyst and the end data scientist with this data that we don't necessarily care about. But if your experiment influences whether or not you're going to be categorized as a bot or not, that's going to be an issue in terms of proper analysis and understanding your experiment. And so the one example Ronnie gave was a great example of this situation. Okay, so now here's the initial slide for the next part. I'm going to go ahead and get started. One thing I wanted to just talk about, a gentleman came and talked to me when we went on break and asked about the fact that we don't filter out, we don't remove bot data, but we separate out bot data, and made the good comment that how we detect a bot is not a perfect algorithm. We don't know exactly who a bot is, and that's absolutely right. But I think the main point to realize here is that the important notion, especially from an A/B experimentation concept, is that it is equally imperfect for treatment and control. Okay, so I wanted to make that good point that I had a conversation with at break. Okay, so now for the next two topics in this section, I'm going to be covering essentially a lot of different examples, a lot of different features that we have in our specific platform that we've created and honed over the 5+ years that we've been running a lot of experiments on Bing.com and other properties. And so I know a lot of you come from an academic background, but especially when you think about doing A/B experimentation, a lot of the things that we do here have been very helpful in terms of understanding and establishing quality and trustworthiness in your experiment. Okay, and so let's get to it. For these mechanisms, I split them up into what I call global mechanisms and local mechanisms. And so we'll start with global. And I think one of the things Ronnie mentioned already, I'll repeat it again. I think the most important one really is about running an AA experiment. And not just running a single AA experiment, run multiple AA experiments. Have an AA experiment that's always running. And they serve a lot of different purposes. And so as Ronnie mentioned, he had a similar set of plots here. You look at the p-values. In an AA, you have a uniform distribution. In the situation down here, you don't have a uniform distribution. And then, from a systems perspective, this continuously running AA experiment can be used just as a canary to ensure that your platform is up and running. If that experiment's running, if the analyses are being generated, then your system is in a good baseline state. And then also, you can actually use this data for reporting purposes. That's a great way to leverage your system for other scenarios. Okay, so AA, definitely important. Now, from a real-time analytics perspective, this is another good thing, another good set of tools that we have available to us. Just by looking, just to understand, is my experiment running like it should? So here we have real-time counters that tell you how often assignments are being made. So if you're setting up a 50-50 experiment, and you see these two lines look like they're the same, of course we're going to have natural variation. Things look just fine. We can stress test the system like we do over here. Okay, we want to make sure half of our assignments go to treatment and half of ours go to control. Again, there's some variation, which is established by having some bounds. And so if we're in the green zone, this is just a good test for randomization. Okay. Now another thing that we do. Question.
How do you control for the cost of actually gathering the metrics? You made the statement earlier that every 4 milliseconds is one full-time engineer. And you've got 2,000 metrics. Do you also put limits on how much total time you spend on collecting metrics?
So, like processing compute time?
Yeah, I mean, by the fact that you're observing, you're slowing down the system.
Yeah, and so let me repeat the question because Ronnie was asked earlier. So the question was essentially, how do you attribute for the fact that running experiments itself has a cost? Is that like the core of the question?
Or even just gathering the metrics.
Yeah, and so there are two kind of points to that, I think. The first point about the actual cost of the fact that you're putting users on an experience that may be detrimental, and then the actual system itself incurs a cost to do randomization that you have to do, that you wouldn't do if you weren't running experiments. That leads into this slide I have right here, in that in a lot of cases, once we have partners that mature, we put them through what's called a holdout experiment, and I know a lot of other companies do this also that run experiments, where this is an experiment itself, where when we do experiments, the first thing we do is we randomize the user, and if they're in part of this first 10%, then we don't expose them to any experiments at all. And so this is a very stable set of users that we can compare to the other set of users that are continuously running, that we're continuously running experiments against. And we can now compare these using the same exact infrastructure and have an assessment of what we call the cost of experimentation. And that's the live site cost. Now there is also, as you mentioned, cost in which we have to purchase computers to do the analyses. It costs conceptually 10 times more to calculate 2,000 metrics than it does 200. That's kind of out of scope for this tutorial, but it helps to be a large company like Microsoft. Question?
Was there any finding when you do this? Like if there's a stable set of users, then have you observed anything over a period of time?
Oh yeah, we do. And I'm sorry I can't go into too much detail, but there's a lot of useful, insightful information about it, and it's also very helpful from a kind of live site perspective, where if we observe a serious issue happening with the company, we can easily go back to this data and ask ourselves, is experimentation the cause of whatever issue we're observing? So that's a good question. Okay.
There are, by the way, this is in the large-scale article in the booklet.
Okay.
Where we discuss this specifically and some of the impacts that we have. And we know it's costing us millions of dollars just to have the experimentation system.
Yeah. Okay, I'll link to that paper there. Okay, and then another thing you need to remember, great, I think one of these is the paper that Ryan talks about. We have a notion of carryover effects. And so if you don't do randomization carefully, this is a real example. If you run a bad experiment and you stop that bad experiment, users will still look bad and they will do bad things. And it will take a while for those users to go back to normal. So if you do not re-randomize appropriately, then you will run into the situation where if you end up running another experiment at this point in time, it's going to look bad even if it was just an AA. Okay? And here's another reason why it's useful to run multiple AAs continuously. Okay? Now, a nice thing, which we have also, is something that we call Seat Finder, where, as Lucas had a lot of great demos about, this is not dynamic, this is just a static image right here. For conceptually, what we do know is that if you do just some sort of randomization in two groups, you will observe some difference. And the normal range of that difference is a range. And we also notice, crucially, that we see this difference persist over time. Okay? And so what we do is that if we conceptually think about 1 million randomizations we can make, we observe this range. If we have the ability to pick one of these randomizations as one for our experiment, we're going to pick that one. Okay? And so when you put that together, we have a feature called Seat Finder, which allows us to essentially try to make as equal as possible before the experiment starts what our two groups look like. Okay? And that also has benefits from a variance reduction perspective. Okay, now let's go to local mechanisms, which are things that we have available for each individual experiment, each individual analysis that we produce. Okay. Another thing Brian mentioned, worth repeating again, sample ratio mismatch. Okay. It's a test that we do, very simple. Conceptually, if we run a 50-50 experiment, we expect to have a 50-50 split in the users that we have in our analysis. Okay? And this is a statistical test. It's the chi-square test. The p-values differ based on how many users you have. So as you can see in this example, early on, if we have a ratio of 1.05, that may look like it's far away from 1 from a ratio perspective, but since there are so few counts, it's actually normal, and this is encapsulated well with the p-value. But as the experiment continues, if that ratio persists, this p-value will go down to 0, and it'll go down to 0 rapidly. Okay? And so for the 1 hour, 1 day, you can't necessarily make any conclusions, but 7 day, especially 70 day, you have a problem with your experiment. And so these are just example numbers. We know pretty soon in a lot of cases when there's a problem with your randomization. Okay? And as you mentioned, what we do is we block the whole analysis. We do not recommend looking at the numbers until you understand what's happening and fix it. Okay. Now, when we talk about analysis, we spend a lot of time on so-called data quality metrics, and these go with different forms. Okay. So one of the things that we care about is we care about error rates. So conceptually, you could be doing fine, but you could be spiking errors of various different kinds. We have a large classification of different errors that we produce. We have metrics around data validity, where we can understand if we have signals that tell us if other signals are valid or not. Okay, and so this gets deep, but then we have metrics around that. And then there's a notion of traffic composition, where if you think about it from an experimentation perspective, the very first bit of traffic you'll see is independent of the treatment effect. And so this all should remain constant throughout the experiment, what you first see. Of course, what you see overall could be influenced. We could drive people to do other things, and that affects your interpretation. Okay. Now, other local mechanisms we have alerts. So when you do a lot of experiments at scale, you can't expect your experimenters to look at every single bit of data you produce all the time. And so an important aspect here is proactive alerting. So in this scenario, we have an event rate, client error event rate, and we have it spilled out for them. This is what's happening. These are big deltas, these are small p-values. This is an issue, this is something you should look at. Furthermore, in kind of the opposite sense, there are a lot of situations where roughly we believe we did some quick analysis, about 25% of the analyses that we produce actually look like an AA. And so we have proactive notifications to users that say, hey, this scorecard that we gave you, from the metrics perspective, this looks like nothing is happening. Okay? And so we know that, Ben talked about this morning, I call it p-hacking, fishing for statistical significance. If we have this message there for the users, it basically indicates there's nothing more to look at. This looks like an AA. Either power up or move on. Let's see, time check. Okay, 4 minutes. Okay, so now we have these situations. Let's go into understanding your metrics. And so these are the 4 key themes that I have for understanding your metrics. I'm going to go through a slide for each one of these. The first one is a useful theme, trust but verify. In this example, say we have an experiment where we want to increase the number of ads shown on the page by 10%. And we do it. In a lot of cases, we care about revenue, and we see that revenue is only increased by 1.6%. It's not in stat sig. In this perspective, you may think something's wrong, but this is why you really need to verify what's happening in your experiment. Okay? If you increase ads by 10%, you should be able to measure that. And so, if you look at the number of ads per page, this does increase by about 10%. Okay? So not only have you confirmed you run a legitimate experiment as you intended, but now you have a lot of good insight because you have essentially a counter to what you expected. You expected probably revenue to increase by 10% also. It didn't. So this is where you should investigate more and find out. Okay? Now you should also have useful breakdowns. Like we mentioned, we produce 2,000 metrics. And there's a good reason why we produce 2,000 metrics, and that is to facilitate understanding. So we couldn't just have one metric, which is page click rate. We see it go down, but it doesn't answer the question why. And so when you have a useful breakdown like this, you can see that the click rate went down, in a lot of cases because of web results. Other things improved, but overall it wasn't enough. Okay? And so when you have the scenario, you can see other useful breakdowns, and you can easily see we have a lot more metrics in our scorecard. Okay. As we mentioned, Alex is going to talk about the notion that we call heterogeneous treatment effects. Someone asked a great question about this in Ronnie's talk. We do see these situations happening once in a while. Okay? And so it's useful to proactively find them and alert on them. Here's an example where something happened, we don't expect the treatment effect to change so much in one day. And so something did happen, in a lot of cases, something shipped or another experiment happened, but we should proactively notify on these scenarios. And finally, we have a lot of good data at our disposal. We should facilitate and make it easy for experimenters to understand their experiment. And so one nice example that we have, going back to the client error example, client errors have different texts. They have stat traces associated with them. So if you know a client error moved, we should be able to help the experimenter understand what errors happened that drove that move. And so this is a high-dimensional problem, but there are good, simple mechanisms to facilitate the ability to understand and answer the question why. Okay? So in summary, those are the things that we talked about in ensuring trustworthiness. Data is important. We have a lot of good global and local mechanisms, and there are a lot of good things to happen that allow you to understand your scorecard, understand your analysis, and provide scalable experimentation.